I am Molly Maybrun. I am the city's project lead in the city administrator's office for the Howard Terminal project. And I do also have a PowerPoint, which also summarizes the written materials that were in the agenda packet that was published a week ago Friday. So let me see if I can share my screen successfully. Are you seeing that and hearing me?
Yes, both.
All right, success. So this is a response to the written report that was prepared by Professor Aga, which she just summarized in her slides. So I just wanted to start by addressing some of the public comment regarding the independent fiscal analysis and the question of sort of, is this the independent fiscal analysis that members of this body have previously requested? And I would say unequivocally, no, it is not. The primary reason I would say that is because there is no deal to analyze at this point. So I think Professor Aga's presentation that she just gave hewed much more to discussing the preponderance of evidence in academia about what happens with sports deals, which is all useful and familiar information, and for the city of Oakland, very familiar information, since some of those studies could be or were based on events that we have lived. But that being said, the report also spends a great deal of time delving into a hypothetical deal at Howard Terminal, which does not exist. And so many of those specifics are inaccurate. So it was noted by some of the public speakers that this report was commissioned by PMSA. There is a reason that academics provide transparency, as Professor Aga did, about who paid the bills for various reports, because this report was commissioned by the group that unsuccessfully sued the city to try to stop us from issuing the EIR, unsuccessfully challenged that EIR in court, and has opposed every step of this project along the way, including the port's term sheets, the city's term sheet, and the BCDC Seaport plan. So, do I believe that this report is that independent fiscal impact analysis? No. Do I believe it's a great summary of existing academic studies and information that's been generated about sports deals of the past? Yes. I also want to note that we have had no interaction with Professor Aga, so no outreach from her office or ability to provide accurate information, although we have attempted to do that in our report. So briefly, I want to talk about a few high-level topics that we noted in Professor Aga's written report. The first one is infrastructure financing districts. So the report makes an assertion that infrastructure financing districts are a, quote, risky and usually unsuccessful method to provide sports subsidies. This one was a bit of a head scratcher for me, as IFDs are a fairly recent creature of California law. They have been used less than a dozen times, all in the last decade, and to my knowledge have never been considered and certainly never utilized as a method to provide sports subsidies anywhere in the state. In this case, the ballpark would be privately financed, constructed, and operated, so very different than the deal structure that we're all familiar with at the Coliseum. The city has never considered, nor have the A's ever requested the IFD to finance or subsidize the ballpark. The IFD would be used to reimburse the A's for their costs of building on-site public infrastructure and parks. So we're talking about streets, sidewalks, parks, park benches, trees, sewers, electrical lines, etc. That would be public property and would be constructed by the developer at the developer's own expense. So Professor Aga noted the term eligible public infrastructure, that's a term that comes directly from the state law. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about eligible public infrastructure, and those who are knowledgeable about IFDs will, or who have sat through boring presentations that I've given previously, will know that all of the infrastructure to be reimbursed needs to be specified in something called an infrastructure financing plan, which would be coming to the City Council for approval with all of the detail about what the maximum reimbursement would be and for what purposes those reimbursements would be made. But the bottom line with an IFD is that all of the risks associated with funding on-site infrastructure, including delays, cost increases, cost overruns, scope changes, the dirt was dirtier than we thought it was, would be borne by the developer, because it is their responsibility to build and install all of that infrastructure, and they would only be reimbursed to the extent there is tax increment available after the private investment has been made, after buildings which create tax increment have been completed and occupied and placed on the tax rolls. So this is not a, we hope that tax increment might be created. This is, buildings have been built, tax increment is in place, and now we are going to use a portion of it to reimburse the developer for that investment in public infrastructure and parks. And finally, I would note that IFDs have been successfully used in this way, including in our own backyard quite recently for the Mission Rock project, which the professor inaccurately noted is not a beneficiary of this type of financing. In fact, they are, and the Treasure Island project. The second major topic that I wanted to hit on is offsite infrastructure and the assertion that the costs could easily exceed $850 million by 2025. We stated in the agenda report, but as it was misstated again, I'll repeat it. The city's cost estimates do include and have always included inflation. We are aware of it. We are very aware of it, certainly in the last 6 months, as I think everybody is, as they're feeling inflation in their pocketbooks. So when you add inflation on costs that are already inflated, you get a really inflated number. So to be clear, the city has always included cost escalation specifically, and you'll find detail about how we generated these numbers, 6% inflation per annum to a typical construction start year of 2026 is already baked into all of our cost estimates. So by starting from these hypothetical offsite infrastructure costs, adding seaport compatibility measure costs, which appear to just be a swag, and then escalating costs that are already escalated, I would say that the professor overestimates the offsite infrastructure costs by at least $250 million. Also, with regard to offsite infrastructure, there is a statement that the city's potential offsite infrastructure obligation would rely on issuance of a $350 million limited obligation bond. I want to make sure that you all have accurate information about that. Offsite infrastructure, per the council's direction, would be funded primarily by federal, state, and regional infrastructure grants. Now, I want to be clear for the public that this is not unusual. This is how infrastructure everywhere in Oakland and in virtually all cities and jurisdictions in California is built through a combination of tax increment districts like former redevelopment districts, from which the Warriors and Giants benefited in terms of all of the infrastructure that was built out in Mission Bay over the last 30 years, as well as federal, state, and regional infrastructure grants. Those are the primary funding mechanisms for building infrastructure. And that is consistent with our approach here. The limited obligation bond would only be utilized if those sources are insufficient. The $350 million number is also off by a factor of more than 2. We have always, as a city staff team, looked at the potential for issuing a limited obligation bond through the lens of first we pay ourselves, right? So the professor has very aptly described the expenses, which can be unexpected, which can result from projects like this, both sports projects and real estate development projects. And so in looking at structuring a limited obligation bond, we have looked at the projected revenues from the project and the projected expenses from the project, and first deducted from those revenues the expenses that we anticipate undertaking before we look at what the bond proceeds could be. So 350 million is not an accurate estimate. I also want to be clear that a limited obligation bond is quite distinct from a general obligation bond, which is what the city and county issued for the Coliseum and is the more typical debt structure that I have seen associated with these types of sports facilities, although I do not pretend to have as exhaustive of a knowledge of all of them as I'm sure the professor does. So for the public, a general obligation bond is a bond which essentially puts the full faith and credit of the city behind the debt. So it sort of says, this debt is the first thing that when we as policymakers make our budget for the year, the first thing we have to do, just like a household, is we have to pay our mortgage, right? We have to pay our mortgage, we have to make our car payment, etc. It's a general obligation debt. A limited obligation debt is quite different, as you can tell from the name. And what it does is it gives recourse to the bondholders to only a certain set of revenues, in this case, revenues that are directly generated by the project. And in that way, it does keep those bondholders more remote from the city's general fund. Last, on offsite infrastructure, there was a discussion about the additional maintenance costs that would be associated with the offsite infrastructure, and the fact that there was no dedicated revenue stream to cover their expense. To be clear, all of the offsite infrastructure, with the exception of the grade separated crossings, are existing public streets in the city of Oakland, which the city currently maintains out of our general fund. So these are not new costs. These are costs we currently undertake. I think that it's reasonable to say that some of the maintenance costs will increase because we are essentially improving or installing, elements like street trees that might not exist today. I think it's also quite fair to say in many cases, the maintenance costs will decrease because we are replacing infrastructure that is decades, or in some cases centuries old, with brand new infrastructure, which costs much less to maintain and will not need to be replaced again for some time in the future. And also that all new public streets and parks that we talked about, that on-site public infrastructure earlier, would be maintained by the developer at the developer's expense, not the city. So existing streets, which the city is currently maintaining, it would continue to do so. New streets would be maintained by the developer. With regard to projected revenues and community benefits, there is a statement in the report that many of the community benefits derive from increased property tax revenues, and that if those fall short of expectations for macroeconomic reasons, we essentially may not see these community benefits. I'm paraphrasing there, but you can see the quote. I just want to be clear that the only community benefit that is tied in the council approved term sheet to property tax increment is offsite affordable housing. That is the only one which is proposed to be funded through the EIFD. In that, you may recall that the council approved a term sheet in which 20% of all IFD revenues would be set aside up to a cap of $50 million. Given the amount of tax increment that is expected to be produced by this EIFD, I think the idea that we would not reach that 50 million is extremely remote. However, it would take longer. So I will, and time is money. So I think there's some truth to that, but it would not feasibly reduce the total amount of money that's set aside for that purpose. And finally, it is worth noting that there is an alignment of interests between the developer and the city here in terms of wanting to develop the site as quickly as possible and as densely as possible, because the faster it's developed and the more densely it's developed, the more tax increment is produced and the more tax increment is available for both community benefits and for the developer to be reimbursed for the construction of public infrastructure. With regard to impacts to port activity, there are references in several places in the report about significant and unavoidable traffic disruptions that will affect not only the health and safety of individuals, but will affect economic activity in downtown and the port. I do want to note there is no such thing as a significant and unavoidable traffic disruption. That's a term in CEQA, and traffic disruptions are not CEQA impacts. That being said, we understand that's a distinction without a difference to the general public. And for those who are experiencing traffic disruptions, nobody likes them. So, and they do have the potential to create the types of negative externalities that the professor discussed. And so this is something that we spent a great deal of time in the drafting of the EIR, working with the port, who had its own independent traffic consultant who peer reviewed all of the city consultants' work and in fact stress tested that work to see, look at several worst case scenarios about what might happen if some of the assumptions in the traffic analysis were incorrect. What we found is that with all of that offsite infrastructure investment that needs to be made, traffic flow at Adeline and 3rd, which is the main entry point to the port, would improve as compared to current conditions. It would improve on game days and it would improve every day. The intersection of 5th and Union Street, which brings port drayage trucks from I-80 to the seaport, would also improve, and overall, most streets will operate similarly on game days as compared to existing conditions. So all of that investment in infrastructure is not for nothing. It does buy us quite a bit of improvements in terms of traffic flow, as well as traffic safety, multimodal options that don't exist today, bikes, peds, more sustainable forms of transportation. This one was puzzling, so I just wanted to call it out because it's really completely inaccurate, and I want to set the record straight on this. There is no concept that the phase 1 stadium development would be allowed to open with only on-site infrastructure in place. All infrastructure improvements and operational measures that are required to mitigate potentially significant transportation safety impacts or address non-safe CEQA traffic impacts like traffic congestion are clearly identified in the EIR in 140 pages in great depth as either mitigation measures or non-CEQA recommendations. Most of those are required prior to ballpark opening. There is also a section of the report which is dedicated to the turning basin. For those who are not familiar, there is an existing turning basin at the southwest corner of the site. The port has reserved 10 acres of the 50-acre site in their term sheet with PAs for construction or enlargement or realignment of that turning basin. As the ships that call the port grow longer, the turning basin is sort of becoming too small. And so there has been a project moving forward in parallel led by the port and the Army Corps of Engineers to identify the best alignment for that. The tentatively selected plan, which was published in December of 2021 by the Army Corps, in fact, requires only about 2.5 acres. So remember, the port set aside 10. Army Corps says we think we only need 2.5. And the port's term sheet requires, and I'm going to quote here, that the A's waive any claims to payment or compensation from the port for the port's election to use all or any portion of those lands. So the idea that this would be costly or difficult to implement seems unlikely to me. And then last, macroeconomic trends. So there's definitely some discussion throughout the report about how the risks to the city might change as a result of some of the bigger changes that we see out there in the world. So specifically, rising inflation, interest rates, and reduced access to capital, which might lead this project to build out more slowly or less densely, or some combination thereof. And I think that is a reasonably foreseeable outcome given where we are currently. And so given that that is a reasonably foreseeable outcome, I think the key is to structure the transaction in such a way that those risks are appropriately borne by the developer and not by the city. So further, the report goes on to state that if expenses rise or revenues fall short of projections, taxpayers will be further responsible for infrastructure costs under the current term sheet. Again, I want to go back to the direction that Council has provided. Council has never authorized staff to consider the use of existing general fund revenues for project costs, and has instead authorized staff to utilize only new taxes that would not exist but for the project, to pursue federal, state, regional, and other funding sources for offsite transportation infrastructure, and to protect the city's general fund. And as such, the primary public finance tools that we have looked at for this project, the IFD and the LOB, would be payable only from incremental project tax revenue. Further, as I noted, there is no deal at present, so City Council could elect to limit the city's offsite infrastructure obligations to only those improvements for which it already has adequate funding. As you know, we brought a item, our major projects team brought an item forward last week, and that funding level today stands at around $375 million. On macroeconomic trends, and the professor touched on this in her presentation, that none of these economic factors, meaning if these economic factors come to play and the project builds out, less densely or more slowly, that doesn't change the infrastructure that's required. And in fact, I wrote down one phrase that the professor said, because it kind of caught my ear, so to speak, that the idea that these improvements are only needed because of the site location. I think that speaks to just a fundamental lack of understanding of this location and of the transportation dynamics in this area. These improvements have been needed for decades, honestly. If you talk to UPRR, if you talk to the tenants of Jack London Square, people who live there, if you talk to Capitol Corridor, port tenants, you will hear an earful about what a mess this area is from a transportation standpoint. So I think our entire team takes great pride in the fact that we have, in the course of 1 year, raised an amazing amount of infrastructure money, which will benefit Oakland and be available to Oakland's communities, and to our port to make improvements that have been deferred for decades, or in some cases centuries. And these will go forward, and they will benefit all of these stakeholders, whether or not the ballpark is ever built. as noted, we have already secured $375 million for these purposes. These are to make improvements on existing public rights-of-way and city streets that are used by Oaklanders and visitors to Oakland every day, not just for a billionaire ballpark owner, as many opponents like to say. And that process will begin early in 2023 based on council's direction just last week. So those improvements will move forward, and we will deploy those funds in 2023 jointly, city and port, whether or not the ballpark project ever moves forward. So in conclusion, just a couple of high-level responses to things we've heard in public comment or private conversation. Just to clarify, the July 2021 term sheet is non-binding. So any discussion about obligations that the city has taken on, you need to substitute in your mind obligations that the city has contemplated taking on. The city and the A's have not reached an agreement. The city has no obligations under the term sheet. Current status of the negotiations between the city and the A's. So we did receive detailed feedback from the council in July 2021 in the form of the term sheet. Based on that direction, staff, my team, has been working to negotiate a deal structure that, if approved, would not place the city's general fund at risk. To date, we have not been able to arrive at an agreement on a potential deal structure that meets this goal with the A's, and thus negotiations are ongoing and will continue into 2023. So while I understand that folks are impatient to get an independent fiscal analysis, one cannot, with any accuracy, analyze a deal which does not yet exist. So what's next? If and when the parties reach agreement, there'll be a whole bunch of things coming back to the council: general plan amendment and rezoning, map and preliminary development plan, development agreement, public infrastructure and financing agreement, which is really where the meat of most of what we're talking about today would live, non-relocation agreement, event day cost reimbursement agreement, resolution of intention to form an IFD, and the infrastructure financing plan, which is really sort of the guiding document, if you will, of the IFD that details what infrastructure would be reimbursed and to what degree. And I do just want to note that, sorry, I accidentally fast forwarded, that the IFP is legally required element of forming an IFD and is very prescribed in terms of what it needs to include. So there's no chance that an IFD will be formed without full transparency on those items. So when will you see an in-depth analysis of the fiscal impacts of the proposed project? So the way our process works in Oakland, most of these items would go to Planning Commission first, and then they would proceed back to this committee to CED, which is the point at which we would provide an in-depth review of the fiscal impacts of any deal terms actually, not hypothetically, negotiated and recommended by staff. And the city has retained its own team of financial consultants, all of whom are very experienced in transactions of this type, to both advise on an ongoing basis and analyze the proposed transaction. And finally, what about this report? You know, am I telling you ignore it? And the answer is no. I don't think you should ignore it. I think there's a lot of inaccurate information as relates to the specifics of this deal. And I think there's a lot of useful information as relates to sports deals writ large. This is a case where in Oakland, we talk a lot about the value of lived experience. And so I think it's important to look for good information wherever you can find it. The professor has brought to the table a lot of academic work around this, and I think that's certainly valuable. But I would also say that in Oakland, we've been to the school of hard knocks when it comes to what can go wrong when you make deals with sports teams. And so, I think we probably agree in many ways with the professor on the essential questions that we need to grapple with as a city in order to decide, is any potential deal that comes before the city a good deal or a bad deal? Are we overpaying? Are we not paying enough? Are we providing more subsidy than is required? Are we getting enough benefit, right? So some of the really guiding questions that we have grappled with as staff in these negotiations is, what is an equitable distribution of the substantial costs of building infrastructure, both on and off site, between the public and private parties, both of whom will benefit greatly, honestly, from that? How do we protect future generations of Oakland taxpayers from being left holding the bag, so to speak, as we have been by sports deals of the past? How do we use this project to catalyze public investment like that $375 million in infrastructure money that we just talked about, and to optimize the public benefits of the project rather than just the private benefits of the project? And how do we ensure that we can build this project in a way that ensures both the port and the city can continue to grow and thrive? So I am not going to read every word on this page, but I just wanted to sort of give you council members on the CED committee a little bit of a rubric or a cheat sheet in terms of how we on the negotiating team think about, this and grapple with this question of, is this a good deal? And is this a deal I would feel comfortable going in a public meeting and telling the decision makers of my city, I think this is a good deal and you should go forward with it or not, right? So there's two sort of sides to this coin, risk and reward, right? So there are any number of different deal scenarios that could come forward. This is not meant to be exhaustive of all potential transaction structures, but to give you sort of a yardstick, for lack of a better term, of thinking about risk. So highest risk scenarios would be ones in which the city is responsible for funding and building all offsite infrastructure on a schedule prescribed by the A's, regardless of whether or not we're ever able to secure enough federal, state, and regional funding. I think this is the scenario which the professor's report assumes we're in. City forms an IFD and issues the LOB and uses those LOB proceeds to reimburse the A's for on-site infrastructure, meaning that we don't have the ability to use those proceeds for off-site infrastructure. And you have to then think about, if we're essentially acting as a contractor, for lack of a better term, in building this offsite infrastructure, and it needs to be done by a date certain, what happens if that date comes and goes? What's the city's liability? Taking that risk down a notch might involve the city still being responsible for funding all of that offsite infrastructure, but keeping the non-property tax increment, the ability to issue the LOB, and to use that to supplement federal, state, and regional funding for offsite infrastructure. It might also involve sharing the responsibility for actually constructing offsite infrastructure between the city and the A's, and limiting the city's liability related to being able to perform on its responsibilities related to constructing offsite infrastructure. Again, reducing the city's, and this is all from the city's perspective, reducing the city's risk kind of another level. We could form an IFD, retain all that non-property tax increment. We could sort of divvy up responsibility for paying for and building offsite infrastructure in various ways that make sense. I mean, one way is really looking at who benefits most greatly from a particular piece of infrastructure. There's also just pragmatic considerations like construction sequencing and where construction trucks that are building on site are going to be using off-site streets, and so there's pragmatic considerations that might come into play there. And then the lowest risk would be the city forms an IFD, never issues a lob, keeps all the rest of the tax increment, and simply acts as a pass-through entity for all of this federal, state, and regional infrastructure funding, with the developer acting as our agent to build it, which is what we did at the Army base. So again, these are not all of the scenarios. This is just an example for when and if a deal actually does come back to the council for consideration, to think about this question of risk. And then the other side of the coin that we are always looking at is benefit, and how do we maximize that? And so, the lowest public benefit scenario in this case, in my view, or in our negotiating team's view, would be one in which Howard Terminal isn't redeveloped. This valuable waterfront property continues to be used for essentially container storage, which is not a water dependent use and can be easily accommodated elsewhere in the city and the port. There's no public access to the waterfront. Our property tax receipts continue in perpetuity at about $75,000 a year. We do go ahead, as I noted, with our $375 million in planned infrastructure investments, and the A's may leave Oakland. I'm too definitive here, so I'll change that before I post it, because we don't know. Moderate reward would be one in which the ballpark district moves forward. We get 18 acres of new waterfront parks, a 1.5 mile extension of the Bay Trail. That would be a long Bay Trail. We get affordable housing per our current code. We get an expanded tax base once the IFD terminates and any lob bonds have been matured. We get probably more investment in infrastructure, more jobs, and the A's stay in Oakland, but perhaps with a non-relocation agreement that doesn't really give us everything we would like in terms of security about how long they'll stay, and what we can do about it if they decide to leave. And then in the highest reward scenario, we would get all of those things, but we would also get substantially more affordable housing. We would get a community fund, and we would enjoy a larger tax base immediately if we don't ever issue the lob. And we would get a much more robust non-relocation agreement. So that's kind of my rubric of how we think about the deal and try to assess, what is the benefit to the public, and what are the risks to the public.